Imagine walking into a forgotten town where every door hangs open, where the wind rattles through broken windows, and where graves of children stretch across the hillside like silent accusations. That's exactly what county officials discovered in the autumn of 1871 when they stumbled into Harmonia Springs, Pennsylvania. They came expecting a property dispute. What they found was something no man was supposed to see. 23 abandoned houses, a medical facility filled with charts and experiments spanning 15 years, and the earth itself, heavy with graves of children whose bodies bore deformities so unnatural that local doctors swore they had never seen such things before. But the most disturbing artifact was a journal belonging to a woman named Sarah Brennan. Her final entry, written in a shaking hand, contained just 5 words: "We were brother and sister." Think about that. Entire families uprooted, lured by the promise of healing, only to become test subjects in a medical vision so cold, so methodical, it blurred the line between science and horror. 3 separate congressional inquiries would later bury the evidence. Not to protect the victims, but to protect the public from the truth. They claimed the knowledge itself was too dangerous, that ordinary people could not handle it. But you are not ordinary, and tonight you'll hear what they tried to erase. Before we descend into this forbidden chapter of history, I want you to do 2 things for me. First, subscribe, because the truths I reveal here are truths you won't find anywhere else. And second, tell me in the comments where you're watching from. You might be closer to these graves than you think. This is not just a story about medical cruelty. It's about how power manipulates desperation, how entire systems thrive by convincing broken families to hand over their children in the name of progress. And once you see what happened in Harmonia Springs, you'll understand why they tried to keep it buried. This is the story of the couple who shared parents, a marriage born of deception, sanctioned by false science, and hidden by the institutions that swore to protect us. What you are about to hear is dangerous knowledge. The kind that, once it enters your mind, changes you forever. The nightmare of Harmonia Springs did not begin with horror. It began with hope. The kind of desperate hope that makes broken people willing to believe in impossible promises. The year was 1856. Pennsylvania was bleeding. The coal mines chewed through men like beasts, crushing their bodies in the dark. Factories in Pittsburgh and Philadelphia consumed young lives with smoke, blades, and exhaustion. Children coughed blood by 13. Fathers came home maimed. Mothers buried babies who had never even spoken their first words. And medicine, if you could call it that, was little more than superstition dressed in white coats, bloodletting, mercury tonics, hollow prayers. Into this chaos walked Dr. Cornelius Engelhard. Tall, prematurely white hair, eyes like polished steel. He carried himself like a man who did not simply practice medicine, but commanded it. Unlike the provincial doctors who still clung to medieval theories, Engelhard spoke of new sciences: heredity, bloodline purification, and European breakthroughs whispered in the halls of Vienna and Berlin. The people leaned in when he spoke. His words carried authority like prophecy. He talked of a future where birth defects could be erased, where the broken could be made whole, where the curse of bad blood could be purified. And most of all, he had the money to make it real. In a single stroke, he purchased 800 acres of farmland near Conewago Creek, land isolated enough to keep prying eyes away, but close enough to rail lines to receive patience. From the beginning, secrecy was the law. Workers he hired signed contracts forbidding them to speak of what they were building. Families who applied for treatment were carefully screened. Letters poured in from desperate parents, children born twisted, cursed with seizures, limping on crooked bones. And Engelhard chose with an eye so calculating it seemed almost inhuman. By 1857, Harmonia Springs had taken form. Rows of houses built with eerie symmetry, a medical hall that dwarfed everything around it, and the spring itself, bubbling with sulfur, scented water that Engelhard called therapeutic. To the poor and broken, it was paradise. They had housing, food, and wages. They were no longer outcasts. They were chosen. But paradise always comes with a price. And in Harmonia Springs, that price was obedience. Engelhard locked the mail, controlled the visitors, dictated even the marriages. Families believed they were participating in medicine. In truth, they were pawns in a doctrine older than they could imagine. The purification of bloodlines. This is where the darkness begins. The families who moved into Harmonia Springs believed they were escaping ridicule, poverty, and disease. But what they did not see was that Engelhard's true gift was never healing. It was control. He cloaked his rules in the language of science. Families could not leave without written permission, for travel might interfere with treatment. Letters were intercepted and censored so as to avoid distressing news. Visitors were forbidden unless screened by Engelhard himself to protect against contamination. Slowly, the community that had seemed like salvation became a cage, one that its inhabitants willingly locked behind themselves because the doctor had convinced them their suffering had meaning. Every Tuesday evening, the settlement gathered in the meeting hall for Engelhard's lectures. And here, under the glow of lanterns, he revealed the true cornerstone of Harmonia Springs, what he called hereditary optimization. He preached not like a physician, but like a prophet, declaring that human suffering was not random. It was the result of bloodline corruption. Generations of unscientific breeding, he said, had poisoned the human stock. The cure was not medicine. The cure was controlled reproduction. At first, the families were uneasy, but Engelhard was skilled in the art of persuasion. He wrapped his doctrine in dignity and destiny. He told these outcasts that they were pioneers, chosen vessels of a higher science. Their children's suffering would not be meaningless. It would become the foundation of a perfected humanity. Then came the first wedding. On September 15, 1858, Engelhard stood before the community and presented the match of Sarah Graber and William Brennan. To the families, it seemed like a blessing. Sarah had once been plagued by seizures, but Engelhard's treatments had cured her. William, a frail orphan, had been strengthened under Engelhard's care. They looked young, healthy, radiant, proof that Engelhard's theories worked. But this marriage was not about love. It was a test, a controlled union engineered by Engelhard himself. He presented charts and phrenological measurements as if they were divine decrees. He called their match the perfect convergence of hereditary essences. Families cheered, desperate to believe. The marriage was sanctified, not in the eyes of God, but in the doctrine of Engelhard's science. What no one knew, not even Sarah or William, was that this union was built upon deception so profound it would doom every child they brought into the world. For hidden in Engelhard's private journal, he recorded the truth. Sarah and William were not just chosen. They were not just patients. They were blood. They were siblings, and their marriage marked the beginning of a new phase in his experiment, the forced concentration of bloodlines. The day of the wedding dawned cool and bright, almost unnaturally clear for September in rural Pennsylvania. Harmonia Springs glowed with celebration. Women baked pastries with precious flour and sugar. Children were scrubbed and dressed in their finest clothes, and garlands of late summer flowers hung across the meeting hall. To the families, this was proof that Engelhard's settlement was not just a medical experiment. It was a community, a future, a sanctuary. Sarah Graber walked the aisle in a white cotton gown, sewn by the Zimmerman family, her hair crowned with roses from her mother's garden. William Brennan stood waiting in a black suit, hands trembling with the nervousness of a young groom. The ceremony itself carried a strange gravity. Engelhard performed it himself, holding credentials from an obscure denomination called the Church of Human Perfectibility. Few questioned it. He was their healer, their guide, their savior. The vows began like any other, promises to love, to honor, to cherish. But then Engelhard added his own line, a pledge unheard of in any church. Both Sarah and William swore to honor the sacred principles of hereditary science and to raise their children according to the laws of natural optimization. No one objected. To the families, it sounded harmless, another one of the doctor's eccentricities. To Engelhard, it was scripture. As the celebrations carried on with music, dancing, and feasting, Engelhard slipped away to his office. There, under the flicker of lamplight, he opened his private journal and wrote words that revealed the truth beneath the facade. The primary phase of Experiment Series 3 has been successfully initiated. Subjects 3A's SG and 3B's WB have been joined in matrimony without suspicion of their true relationship. Both remain unaware they share the same parentage. Fraternal twins, separated at 13 months. The next phase, reproduction. Anticipate offspring within 12 to 18 months. He noted their physical differences, the variations in upbringing that disguised their blood relation. He calculated probabilities, outcomes, projections, as if love itself were a laboratory instrument. To Engelhard, this was not a marriage. It was a controlled breeding experiment. Meanwhile, Sarah and William returned to their new home, a modest two-story house on the eastern edge of the settlement. William had built the furniture himself, including a cradle that he placed with pride in the upstairs bedroom. Sarah decorated the rooms with curtains her mother had sewn, a Bible on the nightstand, and William's tools neatly arranged in the workshop. They believed they were beginning a life of blessing. But every step, every smile, every moment of joy was already poisoned, for they were pawns in an experiment that would twist the very laws of nature, and their love would give birth not to salvation, but to deformity, suffering, and death. The joy of Sarah and William's young marriage was brief. Within 2 months, Sarah was with child. Engelhard called it proof of their perfect compatibility, a sign that his calculations had been correct. But from the beginning, something was wrong. Sarah's pregnancy was not the glowing promise her parents had dreamed of. It was torment. She vomited daily until her ribs ached. Her head throbbed with migraines so fierce she could not bear light. There were episodes when William would find her standing motionless, eyes blank, as if staring into another world. Sometimes she would whisper of children calling her name from dark corners, voices that no one else could hear. By the time her labor began, the entire settlement could hear her screams. 36 hours she endured, her cries echoing across the hills. And when at last the child emerged, even the seasoned midwife, Charlotte Pennypacker, recoiled in horror. The baby was not right. His head was grotesquely elongated, his skull ridged as though it had been crushed and reshaped by unseen hands. His eyes, mismatched in color, moved independently, rolling and twitching, never quite focusing together. Worst of all were his hands, the fingers fused together into thick, paddle-like stumps. Charlotte had to cut them apart with a scalpel while the newborn wailed, his cries unlike any human infant she had ever heard. William wept. Sarah begged to hold him, but the moment she cradled the child, she collapsed into sobs, as if she already knew his life would be nothing but pain. The families of Harmonia Springs whispered in shock, unable to understand how a child conceived under such perfect conditions could be born so monstrously deformed. And Engelhard, he did not grieve, he did not console. He measured, he took calipers to the baby's skull, recorded every abnormality in his ledger, and made sketches with clinical precision. To him, this was not a tragedy, it was triumph. Proof. He insisted the abnormalities were temporary expressions of hereditary purification. With proper treatments, skull massage, electrical stimulation, and feeding formulas of his own invention, the child would normalize. He named the boy Thomas Brennan. But to Engelhard, Thomas was not a son of William and Sarah. He was subject 3C, the first offspring of concentrated bloodline convergence, and Thomas was only the beginning. For as more children were born in Harmonia Springs, one after another, the graves on the hillside began to fill. Thomas Brennan survived only 9 months. His cries never softened into laughter. His limbs stiffened, his seizures came daily, and his eyes never once looked at his mother with recognition. When he died one cold spring morning, Sarah collapsed into madness, holding his lifeless body for hours, rocking him as though he were still breathing. William dug the grave with his own hands, soil caked into his skin, and when the tiny coffin was lowered, the community wept for them. But Engelhard did not weep. He stood apart, scribbling in his journal, Subject 3C expired at 9.2 months cause of death, systemic seizure collapse. Outcome anticipated. Conclusion: genetic refinement requires successive cycles. Recommend immediate conception of next subject. And so he encouraged Sarah and William to try again. To her horror, Sarah conceived within weeks. The cycle began anew. The second child, a girl named Margaret, lived longer. She was beautiful at birth, her features almost normal. But by her first birthday, her spine twisted into a serpentine curve. She could not walk, her breath rattled with every exhale, her ribs pressing against her skin. By age 3, she could only crawl. She lived 6 years before her lungs collapsed in the night. By then, whispers had begun in Harmonia Springs. Not just about the Brennan children, but about others. The Zimmermans' youngest son was born with cleft palate and malformed ears. The Haverleys' daughter had translucent skin, her veins like blue rivers crawling under her flesh. One infant, born to the real family, had 2 rows of teeth erupting before his first birthday. The burial hill grew. Fresh graves dotted its slope until it looked like a harvest field of sorrow. Still, Engelhard preached patience. He told the families these children were transitional forms, evidence of impurities being burned away through the sacred fire of hereditary science. The suffering of one generation, he promised, would give birth to a perfected humanity in the next. And yet, behind closed doors, many mothers confessed their terror. Some swore they heard Engelhard pacing outside their windows at night, listening. Others claimed that when they resisted his orders, their food rations disappeared or their letters went missing. The walls of Harmonia Springs closed tighter. But Engelhard's grip was strongest over Sarah. Broken by grief, convinced she had failed her children, she obeyed his every word. Her body became a vessel for his experiment, her womb a laboratory he could not create with glass and chemicals. And William, too weak to resist, watched his wife wither under Engelhard's control, while more pregnancies were demanded one after another. By the end of the decade, Sarah had borne 5 children. Only one remained alive. His name was Elias, a boy whose silence and cold gaze made the families whisper he was not quite human, and Elias would become Engelhard's most prized subject. Elias Brennan was not like the other children of Harmonia Springs. From the moment of his birth, Engelhard declared him a success. Unlike his siblings, Elias had survived infancy. His body appeared straight, his limbs strong, his organs seemingly intact. To Sarah and William, this was a blessing, perhaps their one chance at a normal child. But to Engelhard, Elias was more than a son. He was a specimen that had endured the purification cycle. From his earliest days, Elias unnerved the settlement. He almost never cried, not even as an infant. When other children screamed through the night, Elias lay silently in his cradle, eyes wide open, staring at the shadows that crawled across the ceiling. By age 2, he spoke in full sentences, not the babbling chatter of toddlers, but strange, clear phrases that chilled his mother's blood. Once, she found him sitting alone in the corner whispering, "The dead are watching. They never leave us." The other families began to avoid him. Mothers tugged their children away when Elias passed by, whispering that his gaze made their little ones sick. His stare was piercing, cold, unblinking, as if he were dissecting the world like Engelhard himself. Some swore he could stop animals with his eyes. On more than one occasion, a chicken would go limp when Elias approached, its heart fluttering until it died in his hands. Engelhard saw none of this as frightening. He saw it as progress. He brought Elias into his study, teaching him to read by candlelight at 4 years old, drilling him in anatomy and mathematics, forcing him to memorize Latin medical texts before most children could even write their names. Elias did not resist. He absorbed every word, every diagram, every grotesque experiment as if his mind had been waiting for it. Sarah, however, began to fear her own son. She confessed to Charlotte Pennypacker, the midwife, that she sometimes woke in the night to find Elias standing by her bed, watching her sleep. Once, she swore, he whispered, "You are only the shell. He made me from something older." Rumors spread that Elias was not merely a child, but a vessel, the living embodiment of Engelhard's doctrine. Some even whispered that he was not William's son at all, but the offspring of Engelhard himself. The gossip festered, but none dared voice it too loudly. Engelhard's control was absolute. The settlement, once built on dreams of perfection, now felt like a stage where everyone acted under unseen command, and in the center of it all was Elias, pale, silent, and always at Engelhard's side, like an heir to a throne no one else could see. The graves continued to grow on the hillside, but Elias grew too, stronger, sharper, stranger, and as his mind darkened, Engelhard began speaking of a new phase in his work, a phase that would not just study children like Elias, but would use him to create an entirely new order of humanity. By the mid-1870s, Harmonia Springs no longer resembled a settlement of hopeful pioneers. It had become something else entirely. a laboratory wrapped in the guise of a community, its heartbeat tied not to faith or fellowship, but to the will of Johann Engelhard. Every Sunday, families gathered in what had once been a modest meeting hall. Once they had sung hymns of gratitude and hope. Now, Engelhard stood at the pulpit, not with a Bible, but with his leather-bound ledger of genetic notes. He read aloud statistics of infant deaths, measurements of bone structure, tables of cranial capacity, as though they were scriptures. And the people listened. They nodded. Some even wept, not from faith but from fear. For those who questioned, Engelhard had punishments, food rations cut, marriages delayed, fields reassigned. In a community where every mouth was dependent on collective harvests, this was a weapon sharper than any blade. At the center of these gatherings was Elias. The boy, barely 10 years old, sat in a carved wooden chair beside Engelhard as though he were royalty. Engelhard spoke of him as the prototype. He claimed Elias was living proof that the fires of hereditary purification were working. His survival was presented as evidence that the suffering of so many children had meaning. Then the rituals began. At first, they were symbolic, families bringing offerings of hair clippings or drops of blood placed in jars, tokens of their continued devotion to the experiment. Engelhard assured them these traces would align their essences with the coming generation. But with time, the ceremonies grew darker. Animals were slaughtered, not for food but for study. Engelhard forced the children of the settlement to watch as he dissected goats and lambs, explaining how weak blood led to deformity. Elias, always calm, often held the scalpel himself. There were whispers of nights when Engelhard led select families into the meeting hall, locking the doors from within. Through the cracks of shuttered windows, others claimed to hear chanting, weeping, and the cries of children. No one ever spoke of what truly occurred inside, but the next morning Engelhard would emerge, Elias by his side, his pale hands flecked with red. By now, the burial hill had grown into a grotesque landmark, visible from every corner of the colony. Small white markers jutted from the earth like teeth. Mothers avoided looking at it, but Engelhard often pointed toward it during his sermons. Sacrifice is the bedrock of progress, he would declare, his hand resting proudly on Elias's shoulder. And still no one left. Whether from fear, dependence, or the hypnotic power of Engelhard's rhetoric, the families of Harmonious Springs stayed. They obeyed. They buried their children, clenched their grief, and convinced themselves that perhaps their next child would survive. That perhaps one day their lineage too would produce an Elias. But beneath that silence, resentment was brewing. And among the whispers of revolt, one name began to surface. Not Engelhard's, not William's, but Sarah Brennan's. For even in her brokenness, there were nights when she looked at her son and wondered if she had given birth not to salvation, but to something monstrous. Sarah Brennan was no longer the soft, obedient wife Engelhard had once manipulated. Years of burying her children had hollowed her, but that hollow became a vessel for rage. She had endured Engelhard's sermons, his commands, his cold insistence that her womb was nothing more than an instrument of science. But each time she looked into Elias's eyes, she saw not a miracle, but a warning. She began to speak, softly at first to the other women. In kitchens, while kneading bread. At wells, while drawing water. She whispered questions they all carried but feared to voice. How many graves are enough? How many children must die before Engelhard is satisfied? The women listened. Some wept quietly in agreement. Others looked over their shoulders in terror, but the words took root. For the first time in years, a spark of defiance flickered in Harmonious Springs. Engelhard sensed it. He always did. He began tightening his grip. Families who hesitated to attend his lectures found their grain rations withheld. Men who failed to report to labor were humiliated in public, branded weak stock. Rumors swirled that Engelhard kept a list, a ledger not of births and deaths, but of names he suspected of disloyalty. And yet, the whispers only grew louder. One evening, Charlotte Pennypacker, the aging midwife, visited Sarah under the pretense of checking her health. Behind closed doors, she revealed what others had seen. Engelhard had begun experimenting not only on animals, but on the bodies of the dead. Infants exhumed, organs removed, bones boiled clean. Some claimed they had seen Elias assisting him, silently carrying jars of preserved tissue into the study. Sarah's horror deepened. She knew then that Engelhard's vision was not about perfection. It was about dominion. He wasn't saving humanity. He was reshaping it into something cold, something in his own image, but to resist openly was to invite ruin. Sarah had seen what happened to the real family, who tried to leave. Their wagon was found overturned in the woods, horses cut loose, belongings scattered. Engelhard called it an accident. Others whispered it was a warning, so Sarah chose a different path. She began keeping her own ledger, a hidden journal, written at night by candlelight. She recorded the deformities, the deaths, the secret rituals. She wrote down Engelhard's words, his calculations, his obsessions. If she could not yet stop him, she would document the truth. But Elias noticed. One night, Sarah woke to find him standing in the shadows of her room, silent as a ghost. His voice was calm, almost soothing, when he said, "Mother, he knows what you are doing. He sees through you. You cannot hide from him." Sarah's blood turned to ice. From that moment, she realized the greatest danger was not Engelhard himself, but the boy she had brought into the world. By 1878, Harmonia Springs was a settlement in name only. Fields still bore crops, children still played in the dust, fires still burned in the hearths. But beneath the surface, the place had curdled into something unnatural. Every glance was suspicious, every whisper dangerous. The air itself seemed heavy, as though the very soil had absorbed too much grief. Engelhard no longer pretended to be a mere leader. He walked the streets flanked by Elias, the boy now 14, tall and unnervingly composed. Families bowed their heads as the pair passed, not out of reverence, but out of dread. It was not Engelhard's footsteps they feared most. It was Elias's silent stare, eyes unblinking, as if weighing whether they were fit to continue breathing. Engelhard's sermons turned to threats. The world outside these walls rots with corruption, he declared one evening, his voice booming through the meeting hall. We alone bear the burden of salvation. But if any among you betray this mission, you will not be exiled, you will be purged. The word purged sent shivers through the crowd, and then it began. The Haverly family, whose last child had died in agony, stopped attending gatherings. Within a week, their cabin burned in the night. Their charred remains were buried in the burial hill, their deaths written off as divine culling. No one believed it was an accident. No one dared speak otherwise. Sarah Brennan's defiance grew sharper. She continued her secret ledger, but now she began hiding scraps of Engelhard's journals too. Stealing them in the brief moments his study was left unattended. She knew it was only a matter of time before he discovered her betrayal. Still, she couldn't stop. She clung to the desperate hope that if the truth ever reached the outside world, Engelhard's reign might end. But Elias was changing. He no longer resembled a boy. His voice had deepened, his movements controlled, almost mechanical. He followed Engelhard everywhere, taking notes, assisting in dissections, standing silently during punishments. Villagers whispered that Elias rarely slept, that he often wandered the burial hill alone at night, tracing the graves with his fingers as though drawing power from the dead. One evening, Sarah caught him in her room again, staring at her hidden journal. He turned to her slowly, lips curling into the faintest smile. "You cannot save them," he whispered. "You cannot save me. Father says sacrifice is the only truth. You should believe him." The word father broke her. Not William, not God, Engelhard. Elias no longer belonged to her. He had been taken, shaped, molded into something she did not recognize. That night Sarah made a decision. If Engelhard's perfect son was his masterpiece, then she would do the unthinkable. She would destroy it, even if it meant destroying her own child. But Engelhard had been watching her closely, and the punishment for rebellion in Harmonia Springs was about to reach a level of horror no one in the colony had yet dared to imagine. The night Sarah decided to act, the air was thick with storm. Thunder rolled over Harmonia Springs, rattling windows, shaking the fragile bones of cabins. She had hidden her journal beneath the floorboards, clutching only a small vial she had stolen from Engelhard's study. A clear, acrid liquid meant for preserving organs. She told herself it would be quick, merciful. But Elias was already waiting. He sat at the edge of her bed, his pale face lit by the flicker of lightning. His hands rested calmly in his lap, as though he had been there for hours. His voice was flat, almost bored. "You've been planning this for weeks, Mother. Did you think Father wouldn't tell me?" Sarah froze. "You are not his son," she whispered. "You are mine. You were never his." Elias tilted his head a slow, unnatural motion. His lips curved into a smile that did not reach his eyes. "I was never yours. You gave me life, but he gave me purpose." He stood towering over her, and for the first time Sarah felt the raw weight of his presence. A boy who moved like a man, yet carried none of the warmth of either. He reached for the vial in her hand, plucked it from her trembling grip, and held it up to the lightning glow. "Poison," he said simply, before slipping it into his pocket. How disappointing. Moments later, Engelhard entered. His hair was wild from the storm, his eyes burning with triumph rather than anger. "My Sarah," he said, as though addressing a wayward child. At last the mask slips. "Do you see, Elias? Even a mother's love withers when tested against the fire of perfection. She is weak stock. She resists destiny." Sarah spat the words like venom. "You are a murderer. You are not God." Engelhard stepped closer, his face illuminated in the storm's flashes, deep lines carved by obsession. "No, my dear, I am something greater. God is cruel, chaotic, blind. I am deliberate. Every death here is a seed. Every child buried is a brick in the foundation of the world to come." Then he turned to Elias. His voice softened, almost tender. "My son, you must prove your loyalty. Tonight you will choose blood ties or sacred ties, weakness or destiny. She must be purged." The silence that followed was worse than thunder. Sarah looked into Elias's eyes, searching for a glimmer of the boy she once cradled, the boy who had clung to her dress when he was afraid. But what stared back at her was something else entirely. His hand reached for her throat. Sarah's breath caught as Elias's fingers brushed her throat. Not tight enough to strangle, but firm enough to silence. His eyes bore into hers unblinking, as though weighing not her words but her worth. Engelhard stood close, his shadow long and jagged in the candlelight, whispering encouragement like a serpent. "Do it, my son. Cast away weakness. Prove you are the vessel of purity." She chose rebellion, and rebellion cannot be inherited. The storm outside wailed, wind rattling the shutters, as if the earth itself recoiled from what was about to unfold. Elias's grip tightened. Sarah clawed at his wrist, gasping, tears streaking her cheeks. She tried to speak his name, not Elias, but the pet names of his childhood, the ones only a mother would remember. Yet each word choked out was met with his silence, his calm stare, his terrifying composure. And then, he let go. Sarah collapsed to the floor, coughing, clutching her throat. Relief flooded her body for the briefest second, until she looked up and saw where Elias's gaze had shifted. Toward the door. Outside stood 3 villagers, dragged in by Engelhard's loyalists. The Weber family, a father, mother, and their last surviving daughter, no older than 7. They had been accused of hoarding food, but Sarah knew the truth. They had simply missed one gathering too many. Engelhard's voice rang like a gavel. "Weak stock, liars, betrayers. My son, their fate is yours to decide." Elias stepped forward slowly, like a priest before a sacrifice. His face revealed no conflict, no trace of hesitation. He placed a hand on the child's shoulder. The little girl trembled, tears streaming silently down her dirt-streaked face. And then, in a voice that chilled the hall to silence, Elias spoke. "They cannot be perfected. They must be purged." What followed was swift. Too swift. The men who served Engelhard seized the family, dragging them to the burial hill, where shallow graves already waited. Some villagers turned away, others wept, but none intervened. The screams that tore through the storm that night became part of Harmonia Springs' haunted chorus. Cries swallowed by thunder, buried beneath wet soil. Sarah watched it all, her body shaking, her mind splintering. She had failed. Elias had not spared her out of love. He had spared her so she could witness. Engelhard placed a hand on his son's shoulder, pride radiating from his every movement. "At last," he declared to the crowd, his voice triumphant, "the new Adam walks among us. Flesh of my teaching, bone of my design. Through him, the garden will be rebuilt." The villagers bowed their heads, but it was not reverence, it was surrender. Harmonia Springs was no longer a colony. It was Engelhard's crucible. And Elias, the boy born of grief and manipulation, had become its executioner. Sarah's heart broke that night. Not only for the Webbers, not only for herself, but for the world outside, because she knew Engelhard would not stop here. Harmonia Springs was only the beginning. Sarah lay awake long after the storm passed, staring into the rafters of her cabin. Every creak of the wood sounded like a whisper. Every gust of wind carried the memory of the Webbers' screams. She had seen Elias cross the line from victim to weapon, and she knew now Engelhard had won, unless she found a way to shatter his dominion. But how? Engelhard's grip was iron. The villagers feared him more than God. His records were meticulous, locked away in iron cabinets, every birth and death measured, charted, justified. Those ledgers were his crown jewels. If the outside world ever saw them, his empire of lies would collapse. That night, Sarah crept barefoot across the compound, her breath fogging in the chill. She carried no lamp. Only memory guided her steps. The study door loomed ahead, heavy oak reinforced with iron bands. She trembled as she pressed her ear to the wood. Silence. Engelhard was not inside. Her hands shook as she picked the lock with a bent hairpin. A trick she had learned as a girl sneaking into her father's cellar. The door clicked open, and for the first time, Sarah entered Engelhard's sanctum. It reeked of chemicals and old leather. Shelves groaned beneath jars filled with preserved fetuses. Tiny bodies floating in amber liquid, their malformed faces turned toward her like silent accusations. The walls were lined with sketches of skulls, family trees branching like diseased roots, equations scrawled in ink that had bled into the paper. And there, in the center of the desk, lay the ledger, bound in dark calfskin, its pages dense with Engelhard's hand. Sarah flipped through quickly, her eyes devouring every word. The forced unions, the births cataloged as subjects, the defects described clinically, stripped of humanity, the deaths reduced to a single line, unviable. Her stomach churned. She wanted to burn it, to watch it curl and blacken in the fire. But no, that would only erase the proof. The world needed to see it. She tore pages free, folding them tight, tucking them beneath her dress. Enough to damn him, she prayed. Enough to make someone listen, but as she turned to leave, a shadow stretched across the door. Elias. He stood in silence, eyes glinting in the moonlight through the window. His gaze dropped to her hands, then back to her face. For a long, unbearable moment, neither spoke. Finally, Elias whispered, "You shouldn't be here, Mother." But his voice cracked on the last word. Sarah's heart surged with the tiniest spark of hope. Maybe, just maybe, the boy she had lost was still buried inside. She clutched the folded pages to her chest, whispering fiercely, "Then help me, Elias. Help me end this." The silence between them was unbearable. Only the faint hiss of wind through the shutters broke the stillness. Sarah's pulse thundered in her ears as she clutched the stolen pages, every breath a plea. Elias's jaw tightened. His eyes flickered, first toward her, then to the grotesque jars lining the walls, then back again. He was trembling, though his face remained calm, as if two selves inside him were locked in battle. Behind him, the hallway floorboards creaked. Engelhard was coming. His cane struck wood in steady rhythm, the sound of inevitability drawing closer. Sarah stepped forward, her voice low, urgent. "Elias, listen to me. You are not his creation, you are mine. My son. I carried you, I bled for you, I prayed for you. You do not belong to him." For the briefest moment, Elias's mask cracked. His lips parted, his eyes filled, not with tears, but with raw confusion, like a child lost in a nightmare. Then Engelhard's voice boomed down the hall. "Elias, my son, are you guarding the sanctum as I instructed?" Sarah seized his hands, pressing the folded pages into his palms. "Take them. Run, show the world what he is. Even if I never see you again, do this, please." The study door burst open. Engelhard filled the frame, his gaze sharp as a blade. For a moment he looked from Sarah to Elias, reading the scene with terrifying speed. "I," he said, his tone almost amused. "So the serpent whispers in the boy's ear, but I made him stronger than you. He is mine." Elias froze, caught between his mother's desperate plea and his father's commanding presence. The room seemed to collapse inward. The flickering lamplight, the suffocating smell of chemicals, the ledger pages trembling in his grip. And then slowly Elias turned, not toward Engelhard, toward Sarah. He held out the pages, his voice breaking like glass. "Run, Mother." Engelhard's smile vanished. "No." Sarah staggered back as Engelhard lunged, but Elias moved faster. With a guttural cry, not of obedience, but of release, he hurled himself at his father, driving him against the shelves. Jars shattered, formaldehyde spilling across the floor, the preserved horrors within collapsing in slick heaps. Engelhard's cane swung wildly, striking Elias's shoulder, but Elias held firm, years of pent-up rage fueling his strength. "You don't own me!" he screamed, his voice ragged. "You never did!" Sarah clutched the stolen pages, tears blinding her as she fled into the night. Behind her, the cabin erupted in chaos. Engelhard's snarls, Elias's shouts, the crash of splintering wood. She didn't look back. She couldn't. The storm had passed, but her own storm raged louder. Fear, grief, and a sliver of hope that her son, her true son, had chosen at last. On the ridge above Harmonia Springs, as dawn began to break, Sarah stumbled breathless, clutching Engelhard's secrets to her chest. Somewhere behind her, the colony was waking to screams. And with that, Harmonia Springs began to unravel. The dawn over Harmonia Springs was no gentle light. It was jagged and raw, burning through the fog like a blade. Sarah stumbled down the ridge, every muscle screaming, the stolen pages pressed to her chest as if they were her only heartbeat. Behind her, the colony stirred, shouts rang out. A bell clanged, the alarm. Smoke drifted from Engelhard's study, and the sound of splintering wood carried across the valley. Somewhere in that chaos, Elias's voice rose, torn between rage and pain. Sarah's heart clenched, but she forced herself onward. She could not stop, not now. By midday, Harmonia Springs was a battlefield of whispers. Families poured from their cabins, pale and trembling, staring toward the heart of the compound. They had heard it, Engelhard screaming Elias's defiance, the unmistakable crash of authority shattering. For years they had lived under his numbers, his promises, his threats. But once the first crack appeared, fear spread like wildfire. Charlotte Pennypacker was the first to turn. She gathered the women, whispering fiercely of the jars she had glimpsed spilling from Engelhard's shelves. The preserved children, the own viables, he had sworn were buried respectfully. Others joined, voices rising, finally daring to speak aloud what they had long buried in silence. And when Engelhard emerged, blood on his face, his cane broken, his voice a ragged roar demanding obedience, they did not bow. They backed away, one by one, then in clusters, until a whole circle of bodies stood between him and the cabins. His kingdom was crumbling, and for the first time he saw it. Elias staggered out behind him, bruised and bleeding, but standing tall. He looked not at his father, but at the crowd, his mother's words still echoing within him. His lips trembled as he spoke. "He lies. He killed them. He killed us." The air broke like glass. Children were pulled from his path, mothers clutched infants, men lifted tools and axes not in labor but in defiance. Engelhard raised his arms, bellowing about purity, about destiny, about the perfection of his plan, but his voice was swallowed in a wave of screams. By nightfall, the cabins were deserted. Families fled into the hills, leaving Engelhard's precious ledgers scattered, his laboratory gutted, his vision in ashes. Harmonia Springs, once his Eden, became a ghost village. As for Engelhard himself, no body was ever found. Some whispered that the villagers tore him apart, burying his remains in secret. Others claimed he vanished into the woods, limping but unbroken, his mind still scheming in the shadows. Sarah, carrying the stolen pages, reached civilization weeks later, starved, fevered, nearly dead, but alive. She placed Engelhard's secrets into trembling hands of officials who could scarcely believe the horrors they read. But bureaucracy is slow, and memory fades. Harmonia Springs was abandoned, left to rot. The cabins collapsed into the earth, the hillside graves overgrown with weeds. Only whispers remained, whispers of children with wrong-shaped skulls, of a man who claimed he could breed perfection from blood and bone. And sometimes, when storms rolled across Kentucky, locals swore they could hear it still, a baby's distorted wail carried on the wind. Not all of Engelhard's children had died. Some had survived, and blood remembers.